Alright, so today I'm going to cover 12 rookie mistakes that snake owners make. And let me tell you, when I first started into snakes, I made quite a few mistakes along the way, and I've learned quite a lot over the last several years. As a matter of fact, if you go into a lot of pet stores, a lot of times people are kind of set in their ways and they do things because they've always been doing it, and it's not necessarily the proper way to do things. And it gets really confusing because you go to a pet store and you hear one thing, and then you go over to like an internet reptile farm or something like that, and you'll hear something completely opposite, and you get a little bit confused. Just like, all right, which one is correct? It's a little confusing. And then a lot of times, I'd say most people, what they do is they pick up a snake and they don't really know, all the ins and outs of keeping a snake. And a lot of times they'll just kind of make stuff up along the way, hoping that it'll be the right thing. So hopefully in this video, it'll clarify some of the things and steer you clear from making some of these rookie mistakes. Alright, so number one on my list is feeding in a separate enclosure. And let me tell you, if you're feeding in a separate feeding bin, you probably want to go back to feeding in the main display tank. And kind of the reasoning behind originally doing that was so that the snake doesn't get cage aggressive in the main display tank. As a matter of fact, when I first started in snakes, before I bought my very first snake, I used to go into this pet store all the time, and I went in quite a few times where they had all these plastic totes lined up on the floor, and they pull all their snakes from their displays, put them in the plastic totes, and then sit on a chair and try to feed the snakes. And a lot of times they couldn't actually get the snake to eat. And the problem is if you first go up to like where a snake is really comfortable, is just kind of hanging out all day, it's more than likely it's sitting there in a feeding mode, ready to eat. And it's pretty much the full-time mode of a snake is a feeding mode. And then if you actually pick them up and try to move them, they go into a really docile kind of a handling mode. It's one of the kind of the tricks of not getting bit from snakes is switching modes and recognizing what mode they're in. Like Bobby here is really in a super tame handling mode. As a matter of fact, if I tried to dangle a rat in front of Bobby here, he probably wouldn't eat it because he's not in a feeding mode. And the problem is if you actually take him from the main display, you pick him up and all of a sudden he's in a handling mode, you put him back into a feeding tank, it's really difficult to get them switched back to a feeding mode. And a lot of times you can sit there for like a half hour or an hour, even longer with some, especially with ball pythons. And a lot of times once you get them into a handling mode, it takes a really long time to get them back to where they're in a feeding mode. So I'd say that is probably the number one reason. Probably number two where you don't want to use a feeding tub is that essentially if a snake eats a rodent right away, you don't want to handle them probably within the first 24 to 48 hours, or you risk that snake regurgitating, throwing up that rodent. And essentially what you're doing is you're taking the snake as soon as it eats, and then you're picking him up to move him from the feeding tub back into the main display. And I would think there'd be a high risk of regurgitation. So you definitely don't want to use a feeding tub. Alright, so the number two rookie mistake that you may make that I actually have made, and that is not knowing the potential size of the snake that you bought. As a matter of fact, I bought a reticulated python that was 50% Jampea dwarf, and I was thinking, alright, this is half dwarf. How big can a 50% dwarf get? To my surprise, here I am a few years down the road, and that 50% dwarf is actually 17 feet long and almost 90 pounds. Let me tell you, I did not know the potential size of that snake. Alright, so number three on my list is bathing your snake. You definitely do not have to give baths to your snake. There is a few times where I actually put my snake in a warm bath water, and that is when it's stuck in a really bad shed, and usually that is when kind of the humidity gets away from me and the enclosure dries out, and then they have a really bad shed, and it's then you want to put them in probably 85 to 90 degree water for maybe 5 or 10 minutes. You always want to supervise if you're putting them in water. And the other time I bathe my snake is if it gets really dirty, if it goes to the bathroom and then kind of crawls around in it, really makes a mess of the walls and the snake and everything. But I'd say in most cases, snakes are really clean. You don't have to give them baths on a regular schedule. All right, so number 4 on my list is overfeeding or underfeeding your snake. And I've pretty much seen both sides of the spectrum. As a matter of fact, I got a snake on Craigslist. They were feeding once a month. And let me tell you, especially for small ball pythons, they need to eat at least once a week. Some people feed every 4 to 5 days, especially when they first hatch out of the egg. And I'd say pretty much overall, most people say once a week for feeding. But the problem is I've also kind of seen on the opposite side of the spectrum where people will feed their snake every single day. And there's a lot of snakes, but believe it or not, a lot of snakes will actually eat every day because they have pretty much like an uncontrollable appetite. You definitely don't want to feed your snake every day. And pretty much what I do is I go by the body condition of a snake. So if it's looking really skinny, I'll start doing maybe 3 rodents in a week, kind of really beef it up. And if it's looking really fat and punchy, maybe I'll spread it out to maybe feeding every 2 weeks, or for a really big snake, you can actually spread it out to every 3 weeks. And if you have like one of the giants, like a really big monster reticulated python, and maybe you're feeding it pigs or goats or something like that, you may be able to get away with feeding once every couple months. All right, so number 5 on the list is not using a thermostat with their heater. And as a matter of fact, I've seen a lot of internet forums where people will burn the belly of their snake from an unregulated heat source underneath the enclosure. And what you really need to do is you need to take your heat source from underneath the tank, and then you need to plug that into a thermostat, and then take the probe from this thermostat and tape it to the heat source, and then dial in the temperature. I'd say it really depends on the species of the snake. For ball pythons, the hot side is usually about 90 degrees. And the other thing you really want to stay away from is heat rocks, because the heat rocks that you buy in the pet stores are really designed for lizards, and they get way too hot for most snakes. You'll actually see a lot of the forums on the internet where people are burning the bellies of their snakes from unregulated heat mats or the heat rocks. All right, so number 6 is feeding live unsupervised. Let me tell you, if you're feeding live rodents, you definitely want to supervise that, because the rodent can do some significant damage to the snake. And essentially what I do is I pretty much give it a 5-minute limit, and I go through, and if I put a rodent with a snake, as soon as that snake takes the rodent, I definitely want to check on it. Or if it doesn't take the rodent, I pretty much have a 5-minute maximum limit where if the snake doesn't eat it, I just take the rodent out and move to the next snake. The absolute worst thing that you can do is leave a rodent with the snake like for overnight or something like that. It's one of my biggest fears. If I'm feeding live here in my collection, the last thing I do before I go to bed at night is I go through every single tub, make sure there's not a live rodent in there that I forgot about. That could be disaster. And I've seen some terrible pictures of rodents pretty much decimating snakes. You definitely want to supervise when you're feeding live. All right, so number 7 would be not providing a cool side for your snake. So as a matter of fact, if you have like an aquarium or some kind of an enclosure where it's pretty much like it has a flat bottom to it, I've seen a lot of people where they'll actually take the heat mat and cover the entire enclosure, and that's really the wrong way to do it. I've actually done it at reptile shows where I'll cover the whole display case with a 90-degree heat mat, but you don't want to do it full-time permanent. So essentially what a snake needs is, as soon as they eat, they want to move over to that 90-degree hot spot. They want to digest their food, and then as soon as they're done digesting, they prefer a colder spot. Probably, for ball pythons, probably in the lower 80s to mid 70s is probably the coldest. And a snake can kind of self-regulate going back and forth between the cold side and the hot spot. So essentially what you want to do is, most people will say cover 1/3 of the tank with the heat mat, but you definitely want to make sure the heat mat is big enough to cover most of the snake. So if your snake is really big in a smaller enclosure, I'd probably cover maybe half of the enclosure with a heat mat, keep the other half unregulated. All right, so the number 8 rookie mistake that I did quite a bit when I was first starting out is feeding the wrong rodent size. And the funny thing is about snakes is, if you look at this snake and you look at the head on this snake, you're like, how big of a rodent could Bobby actually eat with that tiny little head? He's looking so cute today. And it's kind of funny because, when I first started into ball pythons and snakes, I was like, all right, I need a mouse that is like the size of Bobby's head right here. And that is the incorrect correct size. Essentially what you want to do is you want a rodent that is pretty much the maximum, the thickest part of the snake right here. And if you kind of compare the head to the thickest size of the snake, I don't know if Bobby will let me do it, but it's definitely a huge difference between the two. So I would say I don't normally feed a rodent exactly the size of the thickest part of the snake, but I would kind of use that as a rule of thumb as far as the maximum size. And the problem is if you actually take a rodent the size of the head and try to feed it to Bobby here, which would be kind of like a small mouse or something like that, a lot of times the rodent would be too small and the snake won't even recognize it as food. And it's pretty amazing how wide they can stretch their jaws around a really big prey item. You definitely want to feed the right size of a rodent. All right, so number 9 is you want to make sure that your enclosure is escape proof. And let me tell you, I actually lost a snake here in the house. It actually got out. It was a small California king snake, and I actually never found it. It's been a couple years. And essentially what happened was I put it in like the racks behind me, and it got out between the lip of the tub and the part of the metal that it slides into. There's just a tiny little gap, and it wasn't really the appropriate size of a tub for that tiny little snake. The snake was so small, it was thinner than a pencil, really super skinny. And the first time it got out, I was like, what in the world is a snake crawling around my floor? I put it back in the tub, and then the second time it got out, I realized what had happened, and then I lost the snake for good. And you really want to be especially cautious of this, especially if you have really big snakes that get out. You definitely don't want a big snake cruising through your neighborhood that got out from your collection. All right, so the number 10 rookie mistake that you might make is handling big snakes by yourself. And the problem is with big snakes is normally when you buy a big snake, you're not actually buying the snake as a full-grown adult. Usually you're picking up at like a reptile store or like a reptile show, and you buy it as a small hatchling, and then it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and pretty soon, before you know it, this kind of happened to me. It's like, all right, my snake is 20 pounds, 30 pounds, 50 pounds, now it's almost 90 pounds. And it's like, where is the line between, handling that snake by yourself and where you actually need help? And usually you keep handling that snake a little bit further than you really should. You get to the point where you definitely know that that snake is too much to handle. I would definitely make sure you have an extra person if you're handling a really big snake. All right, so number 11 is worrying about the fact that your snake was going on a fast and just won't eat for a really long time. As a matter of fact, it's probably the number 1 comment that I have under a lot of my videos. People are saying, hey, what can I do about my snake? It hasn't eaten for a month. And let me tell you, with ball pythons, a month going off of food is not really a big deal at all. There's a lot of ball pythons that won't eat for months at a time, sometimes even over a year. It's pretty amazing. And there's nothing you can really do about it except offer food every single week, and just at some point or another that snake will eventually go back on food. All right, so the number 12 rookie mistake that I see a lot of new snake owners make, and that is not having a good veterinarian. And let me tell you, you want to do your research and find a veterinarian before things go wrong with your snake, because you can run into a lot of trouble, especially if you're scrambling at the last minute. I kind of ran into this with one of my snakes, and something goes wrong and you don't know who to call. And let me tell you, there's a lot of veterinarians out there, but there are very few that can actually work on snakes. And if you're wondering where to find them, I'd say the best place to look is at a local reptile shows. Some of these veterinarians actually have booths, or you can ask around to some of the snake guys that actually have tables and are vending at the shows. You can ask them where you can find their favorite veterinarian. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And SD75 asks, do your mice eat their babies, and what kind of food do you use to feed your rats and mice? And those are both very good questions. As a matter of fact, I've been breeding mice for quite a few years, and the mice occasionally will cannibalize their offspring. And I think it really comes down to, especially if you have brand new moms that have babies for the first time, and the mice really don't know what they are. Sometimes they'll eat the first litter, but let me tell you, after they get used to raising up their first batch of babies, a lot of times they'll be perfectly fine. And sometimes they'll eat the first litter or two, and I've actually read on some forums that you should cull those mice, but I find find it pretty much across the board that they're just really inexperienced at having babies. Give them a second chance, and usually by the third litter, they'll be perfectly fine and raise those mice up. And the other thing you have to really be careful of, especially if you have multiple litters in the same tub, a lot of times you'll have babies that mature to a certain point where they don't really know what's going on. Sometimes the immature babies, like the little hoppers, will actually eat the new baby and newborn mice. So you got to kind of have to watch for that and kind of separate them as much as possible. It's probably one of the hardest things with breeding mice is the cannibalism. And pretty much for all my rats and mice, I use Missouri 6F. I buy it from a local feed store. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.